One of the first silent tests she uses is the delayed reply test. On the surface, it appears harmless, a slower message, a sudden emotional distance, a shift in energy that feels subtle enough to ignore. But psychologically, something much deeper is happening beneath the behavior. A narcissistic woman often understands that uncertainty creates emotional tension, and emotional tension reveals attachment faster than affection ever could. So she pulls back slightly. Not enough to leave, only enough to disturb your emotional balance. One day she responds instantly, making you feel important, desired, emotionally safe. Then suddenly she disappears for hours, sometimes days, with no explanation. And what she studies during that silence is not your patience. She studies your nervous system. Do you become anxious? Do you start checking your phone repeatedly? Do you send multiple messages trying to recover connection? Do you abandon your emotional center simply because attention was temporary? LY removed? These reactions tell her something extremely valuable. They reveal whether your emotional stability depends on her validation. Carl Jung once spoke about how unconscious fears control human behavior when they remain unexamined. And one of the deepest fears many people carry is the fear of abandonment. Manipulative individuals instinctively sense this weakness. They understand that a person who cannot tolerate emotional uncertainty becomes easier to control through inconsistency. Because once your peace depends on someone else's attention, they no longer need to dominate you openly. Your own anxiety begins doing the work for them. What makes this dangerous is that the victim often mistakes emotional dependency for love. But love does not create chronic insecurity. Love does not train someone to panic in silence. Real connection creates clarity, not emotional confusion. The delayed reply was never truly about texting. It was about discovering whether your identity remains stable when reassurance disappears. And the moment someone realizes they can control your emotions through absence, they learn they no longer need truth, respect, or even consistency to maintain power over you. The person who masters your reactions eventually begins mastering your reality. Another silent test appears when she begins violating small boundaries. Not aggressively at first. In fact, the behavior often seems too insignificant to challenge. She interrupts you while you speak. She dismisses an opinion you already explained clearly. She jokes about something personal and then calls you too sensitive when you react. At times, she may pressure you into situations you already said made you uncomfortable. Individually, each moment feels small, but psychologically, these moments are never random. A narcissistic woman rarely begins with open domination. She begins with observation. She wants to understand where your limits are, but more importantly, whether those limits actually mean anything. Because there is a profound difference between someone who speaks about boundaries and someone who enforces them calmly under pressure. This is why the first violations are usually subtle. Small disrespect is a psychological probe. She watches carefully to see what happens after the line is crossed. Do you remain grounded and address it directly? Or do you minimize your discomfort to preserve harmony? Many people betray themselves in these moments without realizing it. They silence their instincts in exchange for temporary peace. But every unprotected boundary sends a message to the manipulator. Access has been granted. Carl Jung believed that what we refuse to confront within ourselves eventually gains power over us. And many people fear confrontation not because they are weak, but because they unconsciously associate disagreement with rejection, conflict, or abandonment. So instead of defending their values, they negotiate against themselves. They tolerate behavior T. Hat quietly destroys their self-respect because they fear losing connection more than losing dignity. But manipulators study this carefully. The moment you repeatedly abandon your standards to avoid tension, control begins forming beneath the surface, not through force but through psychological conditioning. You slowly train yourself to accept what once disturbed you, and over time, disrespect stops feeling shocking. It starts feeling normal. Healthy relationships respect boundaries because boundaries protect individuality. But narcissistic control depends on dissolving individuality. A person with clear limits is difficult to manipulate because their identity does not bend under emotional pressure. The most dangerous moment is not when someone crosses your boundary. It is when you convince yourself that crossing it did not matter. Another silent test she uses is the jealousy trigger test. And unlike open conflict, this one is often disguised as casual conversation. She mentions an other man who keeps messaging her. She talks about attention she receives online. She brings up an ex in subtle ways or suddenly becomes unusually secretive around her phone. Sometimes she does it with a smile, almost playfully, as if nothing important is happening. But psychologically, something very deliberate is taking place beneath the surface. She is not simply sharing information. She is observing emotional reactions. She wants to see whether insecurity can be activated on command. Because the moment another person gains control over your emotional state through comparison, competition, or fear of replacement, they gain access to your behavior. A narcissistic woman understands something many people never consciously realize. Jealousy creates emotional urgency, and emotional urgency weakens clarity. A calm man thinks carefully. An insecure man reacts impulsively. So she introduces uncertainty intentionally, then watches whether your need for validation suddenly increases. Do you? You begin trying harder to impress her? Do you become anxious, possessive, overly available, or desperate to win her attention back? If so, the test has already revealed what she needed to know. Carl Jung often explored the idea that human beings project their deepest insecurities onto external situations, and jealousy is rarely just about another person. It is usually connected to the fear of inadequacy, rejection, or being replaced. Manipulative individuals exploit these unconscious fears because they understand that insecurity makes people easier to direct. Once your self-worth becomes dependent on feeling chosen, your behavior becomes highly predictable. What makes this dynamic dangerous is that many people confuse emotional intensity with genuine love. But anxiety is not love, competition is not intimacy, and constantly feeling the need to prove your value is not connection. It is psychological destabilization. A healthy relationship does not constantly provoke fear in order to maintain attention. Real affection creates security, honesty, and emotional steadiness. But narcissistic control thrives in emotional imbalance because a confused mind becomes easier to influence. The jealousy was never the real objective. The real objective was discovering whether your confidence belonged to you or whether it could be taken away by her attention to someone else. One of the most revealing silent tests she uses is the emotional reaction test. This is where manipulation becomes deeply psychological, because the goal is no longer simply gaining attention or testing boundaries. The goal is studying your emotional self-control. A narcissistic woman may deliberately create confusion, contradiction, or emotional instability just to observe how easily your inner state can be disrupted. At first, the shifts feel subtle. One day she praises your confidence, your ambition, your independence. Then suddenly, without warning, she criticizes those exact same qualities. The trait she once admired becomes the trait she now attacks. And naturally, the mind tries to make sense of the contradiction. You begin analyzing your words, your behavior, your tone, searching for an explanation that restores emotional certainty. But this confusion is often the point. Carl Jung understood that the human mind seeks internal order. We naturally try to resolve contradictions because uncertainty creates psychological discomfort. Manipulative individuals exploit this instinct. They create emotional inconsistency intentionally because a confused person becomes easier to influence than a grounded one. When someone keeps changing the emotional rules, you stop trusting your own perception and start focusing entirely on theirs. And this is where the danger deepens. Instead of asking whether the treatment itself is unhealthy, the victim begins asking, "How do I get back to the good version of her?" That question alone reveals the psychological trap. Your emotional energy shifts away from self-awareness and becomes fully invested in regaining approval. The narcissistic woman watches closely during this phase. Does criticism destroy your confidence immediately? Do you over-explain yourself? Do you emotionally collapse when validation disappears? Because if your identity can be shaken through emotional inconsistency, then control no longer requires authority. It only requires unpredictability. This is why emotionally manipulative people alternate warmth and coldness so strategically. Consistency creates stability, but instability creates dependency. The mind becomes addicted to relief. You start chasing moments of affection the same way a starving person chases food. But emotional maturity begins when you stop measuring your worth through someone else's shifting moods. A grounded person may feel pain, but they do not surrender their identity every time another person changes emotionally. The moment someone can control your emotions through confusion, they are already standing at the door of controlling your reality. Another silent test she uses is the guilt manipulation test. And unlike anger or open control, guilt is far more dangerous because it disguises itself as morality. It makes you feel that surrendering yourself is proof of love, compassion, or loyalty. A narcissistic woman understands this deeply. She knows that many people would rather feel emotionally exhausted than feel responsible for someone else's pain. So gradually, she begins placing emotional weight on your shoulders. If she is upset, somehow it becomes your fault. If she withdraws emotionally, you begin searching for what you did wrong. If she behaves coldly or disrespectfully, The conversation somehow shifts toward her struggles, her stress, her wounds, until you end up comforting the very person who hurt you. And what she studies during these moments is not kindness. She studies whether guilt can override your logic. Carl Jung often spoke about the danger of unconscious emotional patterns. Many people carry a deep psychological need to feel needed, useful, or emotionally responsible for others. Manipulative individuals instinctively recognize this tendency. They understand that if they can make you feel responsible for their emotional state, they can influence your decisions without force. Because guilt is one of the few emotions capable of making people betray their own instincts willingly. This is why victims of emotional manipulation often apologize constantly, even when they have done nothing wrong. They begin walking carefully around the other person's emotions, afraid that honesty or self-respect might trigger conflict, disappointment, or emotional withdrawal. Over time, this creates a subtle form of psychological conditioning. You stop asking, "Is this treatment acceptable?" and start asking, "How do I avoid upsetting her?" That shift changes everything, because the moment you become more focused on managing someone else's emotions than precisely protecting your own mental stability, control has already begun. And the frightening part is that it rarely feels like control in the beginning. It feels like empathy. It feels like patience. It feels like love. But true love does not require the destruction of your emotional boundaries. Healthy relationships allow responsibility to exist on both sides. Manipulation only flows in one direction. The moment guilt becomes stronger than your self-respect, you stop living freely and start living defensively.